The Fox and the Geese, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, a fox came upon a meadow where a flock of fine, fat geese were sitting together beautifully. He smiled and said, "I've arrived just in time. You're all gathered so nicely that I can eat you up one by one." The geese cackled in terror, jumped up, and began to wail and beg for their lives. But the fox wouldn't listen and said, "There's no mercy to be had. You must die." Finally, one of the geese gathered courage and said, "If we poor geese are to give up our vigorous young lives, grant us one last favor. Allow us to say one more prayer so that we may not die in sin. Afterward, we will line up so you can always choose the fattest one." "Yes," said the fox, "that is fair and a pious request. Pray away, I will wait until you are finished." Then the first goose began a long prayer, continually saying, "Gah, gah." Since she showed no sign of stopping, the second goose didn't wait for her turn and also started. The third and fourth followed suit, and soon they were all cackling together. Once they finish their prayers, the story will continue. But for now, they are still praying without pause. The Poor Man and the Rich Man, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. In olden times, when the Lord himself still walked among men on earth, it once happened that he grew weary and was overtaken by darkness before he could reach an inn. Before him on the road stood two houses facing each other. One large and beautiful, the other small and humble. The large house belonged to a rich man, and the small one to a poor man. The Lord thought to himself, "I will not be a burden to the rich man. I shall stay the night with him." When the rich man heard someone knocking at his door, he opened the window and asked the stranger what he wanted. The Lord replied, "I ask only for a night's lodging." The rich man looked the traveler over from head to toe, and seeing that the Lord wore simple clothing and did not appear to be someone with much money in his pocket, he shook his head and said, "No, I cannot take you in. My rooms are full of herbs and seeds, and if I were to lodge every traveler who knocked at my door, I might soon be the one begging. Seek lodging elsewhere." With that, he closed the window and left the Lord standing outside. So the Lord turned his back on the rich man and went across to the small house. He knocked on the door, and hardly had he done so when the poor man opened it and invited the traveler inside. "Stay the night with us," said he. "It is already dark, and you cannot go any further tonight." This pleased the Lord, and he went in. The poor man's wife welcomed him warmly, shaking his hand and saying that he should make himself at home and take what little they had. "We do not have much," she said, "but what we have, we give gladly." Then she set the potatoes on the fire, and while they were cooking, she milked the goat so that they might have a little milk with their meal. When the table was set, the Lord sat down with the man and his wife, and though their food was simple, he enjoyed it because there were cheerful faces around the table. After supper, when it was time for bed, the woman took her husband aside and whispered, "Listen, dear husband, let us make a bed of straw for ourselves tonight so that the poor traveler can sleep in our bed and have a good rest. He has walked the whole day and must be very tired." "With all my heart," the poor man answered. "I will go and offer it to him." He approached the stranger and invited him, saying, "If you do not mind, please sleep in our bed and rest your weary limbs properly." The Lord initially declined, unwilling to take the bed from the two old folks, but they insisted so earnestly that he finally agreed. He lay down in their bed, while the couple made a bed for themselves on the straw-covered floor. The next morning, they rose before daybreak and prepared the best breakfast they could for their guest. When the sun began to shine through the small window and the Lord had risen, he ate with them once more and then made ready to continue his journey. As he stood at the door ready to depart, he turned and said, "Because you have been so kind and generous, you may wish for 3 things, and I will grant them." The man replied, "What else should I wish for but eternal happiness, that we too may stay healthy as long as we live, and to have our daily bread?" For the third wish, he hesitated, and then the Lord suggested, "Would you like a new house instead of this old one?" "Oh, yes," the man replied. "If I could have that too, I would be very grateful." The Lord granted their wishes, transforming their old house into a new one, giving them his blessing, and then continued on his way. By the time the rich man awoke, The sun was already high. He leaned out of his window and was amazed to see a neat, new house with red tiles and shining windows where the old, run-down hut had stood the night before. Astonished, he called his wife and said, "Tell me, what has happened? Last night there was a wretched little hut over there, and today there is a beautiful new house. Go over and find out how this came to be." His wife hurried over to the new house and asked the poor man about it. He explained, "Yesterday evening, a traveler came seeking shelter for the night. This morning, as he was leaving, he granted us 3 wishes: eternal happiness, health during our lives, and our daily bread. On top of that, he gave us this beautiful new house to replace our old hut." When the rich man's wife heard this, she rushed back and told her husband everything. The man exclaimed, "I could tear myself apart. If only I had known. That very traveler came to our house too, seeking a place to stay, and I turned him away." "Hurry," said his wife. "Get on your horse. You might still catch up with him, and then you must ask for the 3 wishes as well." The rich man took his wife's advice, mounted his horse, and rode off at a gallop. It wasn't long before he caught up with the Lord. Speaking softly and amiably, he begged the Lord not to be offended that he hadn't been let in immediately. He explained that he had been looking for the front door key, and by the time he found it, the traveler had gone. He implored that if the Lord came this way again, he must stay with him. "Yes," said the Lord, "if I come this way again, I will do so." The rich man then asked if he might also be granted 3 wishes, just as his neighbor had been. "Yes," said the Lord, "you may, but it will not bring you good fortune. You would do better not to wish for anything at all." But the rich man was confident that he could choose wisely and increase his happiness if only he knew his wishes would be granted. So the Lord said, "Ride home, and the 3 wishes you make will be fulfilled." The rich man, now thrilled with the prospect of having his wishes granted, rode home, pondering what to wish for. As he was deep in thought, he let the reins fall, and his horse began to prance and jump, making it impossible for him to concentrate. He patted the horse's neck and said, "Steady, Lisa." But the horse only started new antics. Finally, losing his patience, he shouted in frustration, "I wish you would break your neck." No sooner had he spoken the words than the horse fell to the ground and lay dead, its neck broken. Thus, his first wish was fulfilled. Being naturally stingy, the rich man did not want to abandon the horse's valuable harness. He cut it off, slung it over his shoulder, and was forced to continue on foot. "I still have 2 wishes left," he consoled himself as he trudged along. As the rich man trudged slowly through the sandy road under the scorching noonday sun, his temper grew hotter and hotter. The saddle he carried chafed against his back, and he still hadn't decided what his remaining wishes should be. "If I were to wish for all the riches and treasures in the world," he mused to himself, "I just end up wanting more things later on. I know myself too well. I must wish in such a way that nothing remains to be desired afterward." He sighed deeply and muttered, "Ah, if only I were like that Bavarian peasant who was granted 3 wishes and knew exactly what to ask for. First, he wished for a lot of beer. Second, for as much beer as he could drink. And third, for a barrel of beer in addition." Every time he thought he had found the perfect wish, he dismissed it as insufficient. Then he started to think about how comfortable his wife must be, sitting at home in a cool room and enjoying herself. This thought annoyed him even more, and without realizing it, he blurted out, "I wish she were sitting here on this saddle instead of me having to carry it on my back." No sooner had he spoken these words than the saddle vanished from his back, and he realized that his second wish had been fulfilled. Overcome with frustration and heat, he began to run, eager to get home and be alone in his room, to contemplate a grand wish for his final chance. But when he arrived home and opened the parlor door, there was his wife sitting in the middle of the room on the saddle, crying and wailing, unable to get off. He tried to console her, saying, "Bear with it for a moment. I will wish for all the wealth in the world for you. Just stay where you are." But she called him a fool and snapped, "What use are all the riches in the world to me if I'm stuck on this saddle? You wished me onto it, now you must wish me off it." So, whether he liked it or not, he was forced to use his third wish to free her from the saddle. Immediately, the wish was fulfilled, and she was able to get off. In the end, The rich man gained nothing but frustration, toil, scorn, and the loss of his horse. Meanwhile, the poor couple lived contentedly, peacefully, and devoutly until their blessed end. The Singing Springing Lark, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a man who was about to set out on a long journey. As he was leaving, he asked his 3 daughters what he should bring back for them. The eldest wished for pearls, the second for diamonds, while the third said, "Dear father, I would like a singing, soaring lark." The father replied, "Yes, if I can find one, you shall have it," kissed all 3 daughters, and set out on his journey. When the time came for him to return home, he had found pearls and diamonds for the 2 eldest daughters, but he had searched everywhere in vain for a singing, soaring lark for the youngest. This made him very sad because she was his favorite child. His journey took him through a forest where, in the middle, he came upon a splendid castle. Near the castle stood a tree, and on the very top of this tree, he saw a singing, soaring lark. "Aha! You come just at the right moment," he said, quite delighted, and called to his servant to climb up and catch the little bird. As they approached the tree, a lion leapt out from underneath it, shook himself, and roared so loudly that the leaves on the trees trembled. "He who tries to steal my singing, soaring lark," he cried, "I will devour." The man replied, "I did not know the bird belonged to you. I will make amends for my wrong and ransom myself with a large sum of money. Just spare my life." The lion answered, "Nothing can save you unless you promise to give me what first meets you on your return home. If you agree to that, I will spare your life and give you the bird for your daughter as well." The man hesitated and said, "That might be my youngest daughter. She loves me the most and always runs to meet me when I return home." However, the servant, terrified, suggested, "Why should it be your daughter? It might as easily be a cat or a dog." Persuaded by these words, the man agreed, took the singing, soaring lark, and promised to give the lion whatever first greeted him upon his return. When he arrived home and entered his house, the first to meet him was none other than his youngest and dearest daughter. She came running up, kissed, and embraced him. When she saw that he had brought a singing, soaring lark, she was overjoyed. However, the father could not share in her joy. He began to weep and said, "My dearest child, I have paid dearly for this little bird. In exchange for it, I have promised you to a savage lion, and when he has you, he will tear you apart and devour you." He told her everything that had happened and begged her not to go to the lion, no matter what. She consoled her father, saying, "Dearest father, your promise must indeed be fulfilled. I will go to the lion and soften his heart so that I may return to you safely." The next morning she was shown the road, took leave of her family, and ventured fearlessly into the forest. However, the lion was not as he seemed. He was an enchanted prince, cursed to be a lion by day, and his people were also lions. By night, they all resumed their human forms. Upon her arrival, she was warmly received and led into the castle. When night fell, the lion transformed into a handsome man, and their wedding was celebrated with great magnificence. They lived happily together, staying awake at night and sleeping during the day. One day, the prince came to her and said, "Tomorrow there is a feast at your father's house to celebrate your eldest sister's wedding. If you wish to go, my lions will escort you." She eagerly replied, "Yes, I would love to see my father again." And so she was accompanied by the lions to her family home. Her arrival brought great joy, for they had believed she had been devoured by the lion and no longer lived. She told them of her handsome husband and her happy life. She stayed with them for the duration of the wedding feast before returning to the forest. When her second sister's wedding was approaching, she was once again invited to the celebration. She said to the prince, "This time I will not go alone. You must come with me." The prince warned her of the danger, explaining, "It is too risky for me. If even a single ray of light from a burning candle touches me, I will be transformed into a dove and must fly about the world for 7 years." She reassured him, "Ah, but do come with me. I will take great care of you and guard you from all light." They set off together, bringing their little child with them. She had a special chamber built at her father's house, strong and thick enough that no light could penetrate. The prince was to hide there while the candles were lit for the wedding feast. However, The door was made of green wood, which warped and left a tiny crack that no one noticed. The wedding was celebrated with great splendor. But as the procession, with all its candles and torches, returned from the church and passed by the prince's chamber, a ray of light, no wider than a hair, slipped through the crack and touched him. Instantly, he was transformed, and when she came in to find him, she saw not her husband, but a white dove sitting there. The dove spoke to her, "For 7 years I must fly around the world. But at every seventh step you take, I will drop a red drop of blood and a white feather. These will show you the way, and if you follow them, you can release me." With that, the dove flew out of the door and she followed him. At every seventh step, a drop of red blood and a little white feather fell to the ground, guiding her on her journey to find and free her beloved prince. She ventured further and further into the wide world, never looking back or pausing to rest. The 7 years were nearly over, and she began to rejoice, thinking that their ordeal would soon end. Yet they were still far from their goal. One day, as she continued on her journey, she noticed that no little feather and no drop of red blood had fallen for some time. When she looked up, the dove had disappeared. Realizing that no human could help her now, she decided to seek aid from the sun. She climbed up to the sun and said, "You shine into every crevice and over every peak. Have you seen a white dove flying?" "No," replied the sun, "I have not seen any dove. However, I give you this casket. Open it when you are in dire need." She thanked the sun and continued her journey until evening, when the moon appeared. Then she asked the moon, "You shine all night over every field and forest. Have you seen a white dove flying?" "No," said the moon, "I have seen no dove, but here is an egg. Break it open when you are in great need." Grateful, she thanked the moon and kept walking until the night wind began to blow. She then addressed the wind. "You blow over every tree and under every leaf. Have you seen a white dove flying?" "No," replied the night wind. "I have not seen it, but I will ask the other three winds. Perhaps they have." The east wind and the west wind arrived, but neither had seen the dove. Finally, the south wind spoke up. "I have seen the white dove," it said. "It flew to the Red Sea and has turned back into a lion, for the 7 years are over. The lion is now fighting a dragon, which is actually an enchanted princess." The night wind then gave her advice. "Go to the Red Sea. On its right bank, you will find tall reeds. Count them and break off the 11th reed. Strike the dragon with it, and the lion will be able to subdue the dragon. Both will then regain their human forms. Afterward, look around and you will see the griffin by the Red Sea. Climb onto its back with your beloved, and the griffin will carry you over the sea to your home. Take this nut with you. When you are above the center of the sea, drop it. It will immediately sprout, and a tall nut tree will grow from the water, providing the griffin a place to rest. If he cannot rest, he will not have the strength to carry you across, and if you forget to drop the nut, he will let you fall into the sea." She thanked the night wind and set off once more, determined to rescue her beloved and return home safely. She made her way to the Red Sea, finding everything exactly as the night wind had described. She counted the reeds by the sea, broke off the 11th, and struck the dragon with it. Instantly, the lion overcame the dragon, and both regained their human forms. However, when the princess, who had been the dragon, was freed from her enchantment, she seized the youth's arm, mounted the griffin, and flew away with him. The poor maiden, who had journeyed so far and endured so much, was left behind once again. She sat down and wept bitterly. Yet, after some time, she gathered her courage and resolved, "I will continue as far as the wind blows, and as long as the cock crows until I find him." And so she set off on her long journey, traveling far and wide until she finally reached the castle where the youth and the princess were living together. Upon her arrival, she learned that preparations were underway for a grand feast to celebrate their wedding. However, she said to herself, "God will still help me." She then opened the casket that the sun had given her. Inside, she found a dress as radiant as the sun itself. She put on the dress and entered the castle, drawing everyone's eyes to her, including the bride's. The bride was so enchanted by the dress that she thought it would be perfect for her wedding gown. She asked if the dress was for sale. "It is not for sale for money or land," replied the maiden, "but for flesh and blood." The bride inquired what she meant by this, and the maiden explained, "Let me spend one night in the chamber where the bridegroom sleeps." Initially, the bride refused, but her desire for the dress grew so strong that she eventually agreed, albeit on the condition that the prince would be given a sleeping draught by a page. When night fell, and the youth was already asleep, the maiden was led into his chamber. She sat down on the bed and began to speak softly. "I have pursued you for 7 years. I have journeyed to the sun, the moon, and the four winds seeking you. I have helped you defeat the dragon. Will you then completely forget me?" The prince, however, slept so deeply that it seemed to him only as if the wind were whistling through the fir trees outside. When day broke, she was led out of the chamber and had to give up the golden dress. This left her disheartened, and she wandered into a meadow where she sat down and wept. While she was there, she remembered the egg that the moon had given her. She opened it, and out came a clucking hen with 12 golden chicks. They chirped and scurried around, then nestled back under the hen's wings. Such a beautiful sight had never been seen before. She got up and guided them through the meadow until the bride noticed them from her window. Enchanted by the golden chicks, the bride immediately came down and asked if they were for sale. "They are not for sale for money or land," replied the maiden, "but for flesh and blood. Let me spend another night in the chamber where the bridegroom sleeps." The bride agreed, though she intended to deceive her as she had the previous night. That evening, when the prince went to bed, he asked the page about the murmuring and rustling he had heard the previous night. The page revealed everything, that he had been forced to give the prince a sleeping potion because a poor girl had been allowed to sleep in the chamber, and he was to do the same that night. The prince instructed him, "Pour out the draught by the bedside." When night fell again, the maiden was led into the chamber. She began to recount how she had searched for him tirelessly, enduring many hardships. At once, the prince recognized his beloved wife's voice. He sprang up and exclaimed, "Now I am truly released. I have been in a dreamlike state, bewitched by the strange princess, making me forget you, but God has freed me from the spell at just the right time." They swiftly left the castle that night, fearing the princess's father, who was a sorcerer. They mounted the griffin, which carried them across the Red Sea. As they flew over the sea, she remembered to drop the nut, and immediately, a tall nut tree grew up from the water, providing a place for the griffin to rest. Thus, the griffin was able to carry them all the way home, where they found their child, who had grown tall and beautiful. From that day forward, they lived happily until their deaths. The Goose Girl, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there lived an old queen whose husband had been dead for many years. She had a beautiful daughter who was promised in marriage to a king's son living far away. As the time for the wedding approached, the old queen prepared numerous valuable items: furniture, cups, jewels, and all sorts of adornments in gold and silver, fitting for the dowry of a royal princess, as she cherished her daughter dearly. She also appointed a lady-in-waiting to accompany her and deliver her into the bridegroom's hands. Each was provided with a horse for the journey. The prince's horse was named Falada, and he had the ability to speak. On the day of departure, the old queen took her daughter to her chamber and, using a small knife, pricked her own finger until it bled. She held a white napkin beneath it, and 3 drops of blood fell onto it. She then gave it to her daughter, instructing her to guard it carefully, for it would be necessary on her journey. After bidding each other farewell, the princess tucked the napkin into her bosom, mounted her horse, and set off towards her bridegroom. An hour into the journey, she became very thirsty and said to her lady-in-waiting, "Dismount and fill my cup with water from the brook that you are carrying. I am very thirsty." "You should dismount yourself," replied the lady-in-waiting haughtily, "and if you're thirsty, bend down and drink. I won't be your servant." Since her thirst was so great, the princess had to dismount, bend over the brook, and drink its water without using her gold cup. "Oh dear!" exclaimed the poor princess. The 3 drops of blood hurt her and said, "If your mother knew of this, it would break her heart." But the princess remained silent and calmly mounted her horse again. They rode on for several more miles. As the day grew warmer and the sun beat down, the princess became thirsty once more. Upon reaching a stream, she again called to her lady-in-waiting, saying, "Dismount and give me a drink from my golden cup." She had forgotten all that had transpired earlier. However, the lady-in-waiting responded even more scornfully, "If you want a drink, you can get it yourself. I won't be your servant." Upon her great thirst, the princess dismounted and stooped to drink from the running water, tears streaming as she uttered, "Oh dear!" Hearing her, the 3 drops of blood replied, "If your mother knew of this, it would break her heart." As she drank and stooped, the napkin containing the drops slipped from her bosom and floated downstream, unnoticed in her distress. The waiting woman, however, rejoiced as she now had power over the weakened bride, who had lost the drops of blood. When the princess attempted to remount her horse, the waiting woman declared, "Falada belongs to me, and this nag to you." Yielding to her, the princess complied with the waiting woman's harsh commands to exchange her royal attire for plain clothing, and she swore to keep silent about the matter upon arriving at the royal court, under threat of death if she refused. Throughout, Falada observed and remembered everything. Mounting Falada herself and relegating the princess to the sorry nag, they continued their journey until they reached the royal castle. There was great joy upon their arrival, and the king's son hurried to meet them, lifting the waiting woman from her horse, believing her to be his bride. He then escorted her up the stairs, leaving the real princess below. However, the old king, observing from the window, saw her standing in the courtyard, noting her delicate, gentle beauty. He descended and inquired of the supposed bride about the maiden standing in the courtyard. "Oh," replied the bride, "I brought her along merely for company. Find her some occupation so she is not idle." But the old king had no tasks to offer her until he remembered a boy who tended the geese, suggesting that she assist him. And thus the real princess was sent to tend geese with the goose boy, known as Conrad. After the false bride said to the prince, "Dearest husband, I pray thee do me a pleasure," he replied, "With all my heart." She continued, "Then send for the knacker to take away the horse I arrived upon and make away with him. He was very troublesome to me on the journey." She feared the horse might reveal her mistreatment of the princess. When the order for Falada's death reached the princess's ears, she secretly approached the knacker and promised him a gold piece for a favor. In the town, there was a large dark gateway she passed through daily with her geese. She asked the knacker to take Falada's head and nail it to the gate so she could see it whenever she passed. The man agreed, took Falada's head, and securely nailed it to the dark gateway. Early the next morning, as she and Conrad led their geese through the gate, she said as she passed by, "O Falada, dost thou hang there?" And the head replied, "Princess, dost thou so meanly fare? But if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain." They continued through the town to the fields. Once there, she sat down and let down her golden hair. Seeing it shimmer, Conrad wanted to pluck some for himself. She sang, "O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, make him run after as it flies, while I with my gold hair will play and twist it up in seemly wise." A strong wind blew Conrad's hat far over the fields, and he chased after it. By the time he returned, she had already tied up her hair with combs and pins, frustrating his attempt to take any. Sulking, he refused to speak to her, and they tended the geese until evening before returning home. The following morning, passing under the dark gateway, the princess said, "O Falada, dost thou hang there?" And Falada answered, "Princess, dost thou so meanly fare? But if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain." Arriving at the fields, she sat down and began combing her hair. Conrad tried again to take some, and she sang, "O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, make him run after as it flies, while I with my gold hair will play, and do it up in seemly wise." Then the wind came and blew Conrad's hat very far away, so that he had to run after it. When he returned, her hair was already put up again, and he could not pull any of it out. They tended the geese until the evening. After they had returned home, Conrad went to the old king and said, "I will no longer tend the geese with that girl." "Why not?" asked the old king. "Because she vexes me the whole day long," answered Conrad. Then the old king ordered him to explain what was troubling him. "Every morning," said Conrad, "as we pass under the dark gateway with the geese, there is an old horse's head hanging on the wall, and she says to it, 'O Falada, dost thou hang there?' And the head answers, Princess, dost thou so meanly fare? But if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain. And besides this, Conrad related all that happened in the fields and how he was obliged to run after his hat. The old king instructed him to drive the geese the next morning as usual, and he himself went behind the gate and listened to how the maiden spoke to Falada. Then he followed them into the fields and hid himself behind a bush. He observed the goose boy and the goose girl tending the geese, and after a while he saw the girl let down her hair, which gleamed and shone. Soon she said, O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, and make him follow as it flies, while I with my gold hair will play, and bind it up in seemly wise. Then a gust of wind blew Conrad's hat away, and he chased after it, while the maiden combed and bound up her hair. The old king witnessed everything that transpired. Finally, he quietly withdrew, and when the goose girl returned in the evening, he sent for her and asked the reason for her actions. That I dare not tell you, she answered. Nor can I disclose my sorrow to any man, for when my life was in danger, I swore an oath never to reveal it. He pressed her sore, leaving her no peace, but he could get nothing out of her. Finally, he said, If you will not tell me, tell it to the iron oven, and went away. She then crept into the iron oven, weeping and lamenting. At last, she opened her heart and said, Here I sit forsaken by all the world. I am a king's daughter, and a wicked waiting woman forced me to give up my royal garments and my place at the bridegroom's side. Now I am made a goose girl and have to do mean service. If my mother knew, it would break her heart. Outside, the old king was standing by the oven door, listening to everything she said. He called to her and told her to come out of the oven. He had royal clothing brought for her, marveling at how beautiful she was. The old king then summoned his son and proved to him that he had the wrong bride, as she was actually just a waiting woman, while the true bride was the goose girl before him. The prince was overjoyed at her beauty and gentleness. A grand feast was prepared, and all the courtiers and friends were invited. During the feast, the bridegroom sat with the princess on one side and the waiting woman on the other. The false bride did not recognize the true one, dazzled by her splendid attire. After everyone had eaten, drunk, and made merry, the old king posed a question to the waiting woman about what punishment someone deserved who had deceived her masters in such a manner. He recounted the entire story and concluded by asking, Now, what punishment does such a person deserve? No better than this, replied the false bride, that she be put naked into a cask studded inside with sharp nails and dragged through the streets by 2 white horses until she is dead. You have pronounced your own sentence, said the old king. As you have said, so shall it be done. And when the sentence was carried out, the prince married the true bride. They ruled over their kingdom in peace and happiness for the rest of their days. The Young Giant. A fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, a farmer had a son who was as big as a thumb and did not grow any larger for several years. One day, when the father was going out to plow, the little one said, Father, I want to come with you. You want to come with me? Said the father. Stay here. You won't be of any use out there, and you might get lost. Thumbling started to cry, so to pacify him, his father put him in his pocket and took him along. Once they were in the field, he took Thumbling out and placed him in a freshly plowed furrow. While he was there, a giant came over the hill. Do you see that big ogre? Said the father, trying to scare the little fellow into behaving. He's coming to take you away. But the giant had barely taken a few steps with his long legs before he reached the furrow. He carefully picked up Thumbling with 2 fingers, examined him, and without saying a word, carried him away. His father stood there in shock, unable to utter a sound, thinking his child was lost forever. The giant took him home, nursed him, and Thumbling grew into a tall, strong boy, just like a giant. After 2 years, the old giant took him into the forest to test him, saying, Pull up a stick for yourself. The boy was already so strong that he pulled up a young tree by its roots. But the giant thought, We can do better than that, and took him back, nursing him for another 2 years. When he tested him again, the boy's strength had increased so much that he could uproot an old tree. But that still wasn't enough for the giant. He nursed him for another 2 years. When they returned to the forest, the giant said, Now pull up a proper stick for me." The boy uprooted the strongest oak tree from the ground, splitting it effortlessly. "That will do," said the giant. "You are now perfect." He took him back to the field from where he had taken him. His father was there, following the plow. The young giant approached him and said, "Father, do you see what a fine man your son has become?" The farmer was alarmed and said, "No, you are not my son. I do not want you. Leave me. Indeed, I am your son. Let me work. I can plow as well as you, if not better." "No, no, you are not my son, and you cannot plow. Go away." However, afraid of the giant, he let go of the plow, stepped back, and stood aside. Then the youth took the plow and pressed it with one hand, but his grip was so strong that the plow sank deep into the earth. Seeing this, the farmer could not bear it and called out, "If you insist on plowing, you must not press so hard. That only makes bad work." However, the youth unhitched the horses and took the plow himself. "Go home, father, and ask mother to prepare a large dish of food. Meanwhile, I will finish plowing the field," he said. The farmer returned home and instructed his wife to prepare the meal. In the meantime, the youth plowed the entire 2-acre field alone. After that, he harnessed himself to the harrow and harrowed all the land, using 2 harrows at once. Once he finished, he went into the forest, uprooted 2 oak trees, and laid them across his shoulders. He hung 1 harrow in front and 1 behind, as well as 1 horse in front and 1 behind, and carried everything as if it were a bundle of straw to his parents' house. When he entered the yard, his mother did not recognize him and asked, "Who is that enormous man?" The farmer replied, "That is our son." She insisted, "No, that cannot be our son. Our child was so small." She called out to him, "Go away, we do not want you here." The youth said nothing, but he led the horses to the stable, giving them oats and hay, and tended to all their needs. After finishing this, he entered the parlor, sat on the bench, and said, "Mother, I would like something to eat. Is it ready?" She responded, "Yes," and brought in 2 enormous dishes filled with food, enough to feed herself and her husband for a week. However, the youth devoured all of it by himself and asked if there was more. "No," she replied, "that is all we have." "That was just a taste," he said. "I need more." Not daring to oppose him, she went and put a huge cauldron of food on the fire. When it was ready, she carried it in. "At last, some proper crumbs," he remarked, and ate everything, yet he still was not satisfied. Then he said, "Father, I see that with you, I will never have enough to eat. If you get me an iron staff that is strong and cannot be broken over my knees, I will go out into the world." The farmer, eager to please, harnessed his 2 horses to a cart and fetched from the smith a staff so large and thick that the 2 horses could barely bring it back. The youth laid it across his knees and, with a snap, broke it in 2 like a beanstalk and tossed it aside. The father then harnessed 4 horses and brought a bar that was even longer and thicker, one that the 4 horses could only just manage to drag. His son broke this in 2 as well, against his knees, and threw it away, saying, "Father, this is useless. You must harness more horses and fetch me a stronger staff." The father then harnessed 8 horses and fetched a staff so long and thick that the 8 horses could barely carry it. When the son took it in his hand, he broke off a piece from the top and said, "Father, I see that you will never be able to find me a staff strong enough. I will stay no longer with you." With that, he set off and announced that he was now a smith's apprentice. He arrived at a village where a greedy smith lived. This smith was known for his selfishness and never doing a kindness for anyone. The youth entered the smithy and asked if the smith needed a journeyman. "Yes," the smith replied, sizing him up. He thought to himself, "This fellow looks strong and will work hard, earning his keep." So he asked, "How much wages do you want?" "I don't want any wages," the youth responded, "but every fortnight when the other journeymen are paid, I will give you 2 blows, and you must spare them." The miserly smith was pleased, thinking he would save a lot of money this way. The next morning, the new journeyman began work. When the master brought a glowing iron bar, and the youth struck his first blow, the iron shattered into pieces, and the anvil sank so deeply into the earth that it couldn't be retrieved. The miser grew angry and said, "I can't make any use of you. You strike too powerfully. What will you take for just 1 blow?" "I'll give you just a small blow," replied the youth. He then raised his foot, and gave the smith such a kick that he flew over 4 loads of hay. Afterward, the youth sought out the thickest iron bar in the smithy, took it as a staff, and continued on his way. After walking for some time, he came to a small farm and asked the bailiff if he needed a head servant. "Yes," said the bailiff, "I can use one. You look strong enough to be useful. How much do you want a year for wages?" Once again, the youth said he wanted no wages, but would give the bailiff 3 blows each year, which he must bear. The bailiff, being greedy himself, was satisfied with this arrangement. The next morning, all the servants were to go into the woods. While the others were already up, the head servant remained in bed. One of the servants called to him, "Get up! It's time to go to the woods. You must come with us." "Ah," he replied gruffly, "just go ahead. I'll be back before any of you." The others went to the bailiff and complained that the head servant was still in bed and refused to go with them. The bailiff told them to wake him again and instruct him to harness the horses. But the head servant repeated, "Go on ahead. I'll be back before any of you," and then stayed in bed for another 2 hours. Eventually, he got up from the feathers, but before he left, he fetched 2 bushels of peas from the loft and made himself some broth. After eating at his leisure, he went to harness the horses and set off for the woods. Not far from the woods was a ravine he had to cross. First, he drove the horses forward, then stopped them. He went behind the cart, gathered trees and brushwood, and constructed a large barricade to block any horse from passing through. As he was entering the woods, the other servants were just driving out with their loaded carts, heading home. He called out to them, "Drive on ahead. I'll still get home before you do." He didn't venture far into the woods, but quickly uprooted 2 of the largest trees and loaded them onto his cart. When he returned to the barricade, the others were still stuck, unable to get through. "Don't you see?" he said. "If you had stayed with me, you would have reached home just as quickly and could have had another hour of sleep." He then tried to move forward, but his horses couldn't pass the barricade. So he unharnessed them, placed them on top of the cart, took hold of the shafts, and pulled the entire load through with ease, as if it were laden with feathers. Once across, he turned to the others and said, "See, I've made it through quicker than you," and continued on his way, leaving them behind. In the yard, he lifted one of the trees and showed it to the bailiff, saying, "Isn't this a fine bundle of wood?" The bailiff then remarked to his wife, "The servant is a good one. Even though he sleeps long, he still returns home before the others." For a year, he served the bailiff. When the year was over, and it was time for the servants to receive their wages, he reminded the bailiff that it was time for his payment too. The bailiff, fearing the blows he was to receive, pleaded earnestly to be excused from them. He even offered to become the head servant himself and let the youth be the bailiff. "No," the youth replied, "I do not wish to be a bailiff. I am the head servant and will stay as such, but I will claim what we agreed upon." The bailiff was ready to offer anything the youth wanted, but it was no use. The head servant refused all offers. Left with no choice, the bailiff requested a fortnight's delay, hoping to find a way out. The head servant agreed to the delay. The bailiff gathered all his clerks and asked for their advice. After much deliberation, the clerks suggested a dangerous plan. Given the head servant's immense strength and their fear for their lives, they proposed that the bailiff should trick him into going down the well to clean it. Once he was down there, they would roll a heavy millstone over the edge and drop it on his head, ensuring he would never return to the daylight. The advice pleased the bailiff, so he asked the head servant to go down the well. Once the head servant was standing at the bottom, they rolled the largest millstone down, thinking they had crushed his skull. However, he called out, "Chase away those hens from the well. They are scratching in the sand above and throwing grains into my eyes so I can't see." The bailiff, pretending to be frightened by the hens, cried out, "Shh!" to scare them away. When the head servant finished his work, he climbed back up and said, "Just look at this beautiful necktie I have on." To everyone's astonishment, it was the millstone hanging around his neck. Now ready to take his reward, he was met with the bailiff's request for another fortnight's delay. The clerks convened again and suggested sending the head servant to the haunted mill to grind corn overnight. Knowing that no one who had ever gone there by night had returned alive by morning. This plan appealed to the bailiff, who called the head servant that very evening and ordered him to take 8 bushels of corn to the mill and grind it throughout the night as it was urgently needed. The head servant went to the loft, filled 2 bushels in his right pocket and 2 in his left, and carried 4 in a large wallet, half on his back and half on his chest. Thus loaded, he headed to the haunted mill. The miller warned him that although he could grind during the day without trouble, no one had survived grinding at night due to the hauntings. "I will manage it," replied the head servant. "Just you go to bed." He then entered the mill and began pouring out the corn. Around 11 o'clock, he went to the miller's room and sat down on a bench. After a while, a door opened, and a large table entered, laden with wine, roasted meats, and other good food, all seemingly carried by invisible hands. Chairs pushed themselves up to the table, but no people appeared, though he saw knives and forks moving as if handled by invisible fingers, placing food on plates. Being hungry, he joined in, ate with the unseen diners, and enjoyed the meal. Once he had eaten his fill and the others had emptied their dishes, he distinctly heard all the candles being snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. Suddenly, he felt a box on the ear. "If that happens again, I shall strike back," he warned. When he received a second box on the ear, he struck out in return. This exchange continued throughout the night. He took nothing without giving it back with interest, ensuring he did not strike in vain. At daybreak, everything ceased. When the miller awoke, he hurried to check on the head servant, curious to see if he had survived the night. The youth then remarked, "I have eaten my fill and received a few boxes on the ears, but I gave back as good as I got." The miller, overjoyed, declared that the mill was now free from the spell and offered him a substantial amount of money as a reward. However, he declined, saying, "I don't need any money, I have enough." So with his meal on his back, he returned home and informed the bailiff that he had completed the task as instructed and now expected his agreed-upon reward. Upon hearing this, the bailiff was struck with terror and started pacing the room in distress, sweat pouring from his forehead. He opened the window to get some fresh air, but before he realized what was happening, the head servant delivered such a powerful kick that the bailiff flew out through the window into the air and disappeared, never to be seen again. Turning to the bailiff's wife, the head servant said, "If he doesn't come back, you'll have to take the other blow." She cried out in fear, "No, no, I can't bear it," and opened the other window, sweat now streaming down her face as well. The head servant then gave her a kick so strong that she, being lighter, soared even higher than her husband. As she hovered in the air, her husband called out, "Do come to me." But she responded, "Come to me. I can't come to you." They floated there, unable to reach each other, and whether they are still hovering or not, I do not know. The young giant then picked up his iron bar and continued on his way.